Hey guys, it's Christa Watson here from Christa Quilt, and I'm excited to show you how to make my charming Chevrons quilt shown behind me. Today I'm going to share tips and tricks to make the entire quilt from start to finish, but I really want to focus in a lot on the machine quilting. Because one of the questions I get asked all the time is, how do I quilt my quilt without getting any puckers during the process? Well, puckers usually occur either when the batting is slipping inside of the quilt or if you're pushing the top fabric faster than the machine can keep up. So here's how to prevent it. Number one, you want to use natural fiber materials so that they'll cling together. You want to baste your quilt really well, and you want to divide and conquer the process so you're only focusing on quilting one area at a time. So be sure to grab a copy of my charming Chevrons quilt pattern and follow along, and we'll make this quilt together. Remember, all of the tips and techniques that I'm sharing can be applied to any quilt that you're making. This quilt is made entirely from 5-inch squares, and the pattern actually comes in 4 sizes. You can either use 5-inch squares or 10-inch squares, but I'll be focusing on the 5-inch square size this time around. I'm using my Good Vibes fabric from Benartex because it has an equal number of lights and darks. But you know what? You can use any fabric in your stash as long as it has good contrast. Following the pattern instructions on pages 2 and 3, mark a line down the center diagonal of each light colored square. Then match it up with a dark colored square and sew on either side of the line. Trim on the line, press seams open, and trim off the extra triangle tips in the corners. Each pair will yield 2 half-square triangles. Line up 2 of the same fabrics on 1/2 of each chevron block. Notice how they are mirror images of each other, so you'll need to make half that point left and half that point right. Join these randomly together to make the chevron blocks. I prefer pressing my seams open because they really make the blocks lie nice and flat. Once each half of the blocks are sewn, I like to stack them right up next to my machine in order so they are ready to sew. Because my seams are pressed open, I'll pin on either side of the intersection rather than right through the middle so I don't split the seams. I like to randomly sew the blocks into pairs so that I have bigger pieces to lay out on my design wall. The next step is to lay out the blocks on a design wall. I'll take a picture with my phone once I'm happy with the layout. That way I can keep the blocks in order as I sew them together. The last step is to do what I call a victory lap. Top stitch around the perimeter of the quilt approximately 1/8 inch away from the edge. This will secure those outer edges from splitting open since there's no borders to secure them. Now it's time for my favorite part, machine quilting. But before you quilt your quilt, you need to make sure you baste it properly. You can use your favorite method, or if you want to check out the description box below, I've given you a link to my spray basting tutorial. It works wonders and allows you to quilt with no issues and no puckers. Remember, there's no right or wrong way to get the job done, only the method that you prefer. So when I quilt my quilt, I actually start on the right-hand side of the quilt, work my way towards the center, rotate the quilt 180 degrees, and then start again in the middle and work my way over to the other side. The reason I quilt in this manner is it's the easiest way to control the bulk, and it allows me to anchor or secure the quilt in certain key areas so that it's not going to shift when I add more quilting later. After a lot of trial and error, this is the best way that I found to make sure that I'm quilting in a methodical way, spreading the even density of quilting across the quilt. Hopefully by the end of this video, I'll have converted you into giving it a try. Here's what it looks like as I begin my quilt. There's very little quilt under the arm of the machine, and most of the bulk is off to my left, being held up by the weight of my sewing table. This is the quilting plan that's included in the quilt pattern. I really like to design quilting plans where I can stitch a continuous pathway all the way across the quilt because it's so much faster and really easy to do. To stitch in the ditch, I'll start in the upper right-hand corner of the quilt. I've rotated the quilt so I can easily quilt each ditch line from the top of the quilt to the bottom. Because I'm quilting on a domestic machine, the base of the machine underneath holds the quilt and it keeps everything stable. I'm also using a needle appropriate to the size of my thread, so the holes in the fabric aren't too big as I stitch. So I'm stitching slowly right in the ditch, and I'm having no issues even though my seams have been pressed open. Contrary to popular myth, this will not weaken my seams. In fact, it will strengthen them because I'm actually adding more thread to the quilt. My needle is set to stop in the down position so that when I get to a corner, I can easily stop and rotate the quilt to stitch each diagonal line. You can see that I've trimmed my excess batting and backing so there's only about an inch sticking out beyond the quilt top. This will prevent the sides of the quilt from flipping under itself and accidentally stitching through too many layers of the quilt at one time. I've used my favorite batting, which is Hobbs cotton and wool. This natural fiber batting clings to the fabric so it won't shift while quilting. Most puckers occur when slippery synthetic batting like polyester shifts inside the quilt sandwich. I spray basted my quilt so there are no pesky pins getting in the way, and I ironed the quilt after basting to help set the glue so the layers don't separate. I'm wearing quilting gloves because those help me get a better grip on the quilt and make it easier to push it through the machine. My feed dogs are up or engaged just like they would be for regular sewing and piecing. I've increased my stitch length to 3.0 to make a slightly longer stitch. This helps compensate for any friction or drag on the quilt. I've also reduced my presser foot pressure to 0. This lightens the amount of pressure on each stitch, making it easier for the foot to glide over the quilt. All of these settings and techniques help me to avoid those dreaded puckers. I'm quilting the right-hand side of each row of chevrons first, and then the left-hand side. This is called anchor quilting, which secures the area in between what I previously quilted. And I'm working my way from the outside of the quilt on the right-hand side towards the inside of the quilt in the middle. The good news is that I only have to shove half the quilt under the machine, and the extra space gives me plenty of room to do that. My Bernina has 10 inches of space to hold the quilt. But before I got this machine, I had an older model that only had 6 inches of space. It's the exact same technique, but just a little bit more wrestling of the quilt. The foot I'm using on my Bernina is called the 20D or dual feed foot with an open toe so I can see what I'm doing. This performs the same function as a walking foot, meaning that all of the layers are feeding through the machine at the same time to prevent puckers. You can use one or the other if your machine has integrated dual feed. It's really a personal preference. I prefer the dual feed because the foot is easier to take on and off, and I'm able to stitch the full width of the foot rather than being limited by the width of the walking foot, which is usually a little bit narrower. This comes in handy when I'm shifting the needle position or quilting with decorative stitches. I'll keep going, ditching each vertical row of chevrons until this part is done. I'll cut thread when I get to the end of each row and then start fresh at the top of the next row. This allows me to stop and change bobbins if needed, and it makes it easier to deal with all the bulk. Now, I'm not stitching every single ditch or every single seam. I'm only quilting the long lines on the outside of each row. I'll anchor quilt each of the rows of the quilt, and that will be my first pass of quilting across the quilt. Now my quilt is anchored and secured in between each row of the major seam lines, and I'm ready to add more quilting. Here's a close-up of what it looks like once the ditch work is done. For my second pass across the quilt, I'll stitch the same pathway, but this time I'm stitching about 1/4 inch to 1/2 inch away from the ditch lines that I previously quilted. I line up the edge of my foot next to the ditch line, and then I can change my needle position to determine the width of the lines that I want to make. For this quilt, I'm actually keeping the needle in the center position because I like that amount of spacing. Originally, my plan was just going to echo the ditches on the lighter fabrics, but once I added some free motion work, which I'll get to in a minute, I decided that I wanted to echo the inside of the colorful fabrics too. So it's okay to change up your plan anytime, and you can switch back and forth between the walking foot and the free motion. Since you know what the plan is going to be ahead of time, I recommend doing all of the echo ditching first so that you don't have to change feet, then doing all the free motion work after all the straight line quilting is finished. I'm echo quilting each line from the top of the quilt to the bottom so I can start and end each line of stitching in the batting. This means I don't have to worry about tying off any of the loose ends. Keep echo quilting so that each vertical row is anchored on both sides of the seam. Once the ditching and echoing is done, I'll drop my feed dogs and attach a free motion foot to quilt switchback lines in the lighter fabric areas. I prefer having an open toe on my free motion foot for better visibility. You can also use a stitch regulator if you like, but that's really a personal preference, and I actually learned to quilt without one, so you don't really see me using one that often. Switchbacks is one of those designs that can be quilted a few different ways. Right now, I'm quilting them up and down while I move horizontally along the quilt. To form each switchback line, I'm quilting a straight-ish line in an up and down way. At the top and bottom of each line, I add a little curve, bumping right into my echo lines on the top and bottom. Now, I'm not worrying about stitch length, I'm rather focusing on texture instead of perfection. I'm not trying to make my switchbacks exactly alike, and I'm definitely not trying to quilt the same number of switchbacks in each section. I'm just letting it flow naturally and organically. I personally like the look of handcrafted machine quilting, where the little imperfections give it character and let you know it was stitched by a person, not a computer. You can use the seam lines as a guide to keep your lines relatively straight as you go. Each switchback is about the width of my finger, but again, I'm not worrying about making them all look exactly the same. So I'm working my way from the right side of the quilt towards the center in each row. Once I get to the middle of the row, I'll rotate and finish the pattern, working back from the center over to the right-hand side again. See how I've switched directions now and I'm stitching back towards the right? For this stitch pattern, you will still quilt half of the quilt at a time. It's just that you'll rotate the quilt with each and every row that you stitch. Notice how my hands are forming a hoop around the area I'm quilting. I'll stop and readjust my hand position whenever I feel like I'm starting to reach. So I'm not thinking too much about quilting a large quilt. I'm only thinking about the small amount of quilt that's in between my hands. My quilt is flat and smooth the entire time, so I can stitch freely without anything causing friction or drag on the quilt while I stitch. Having a nice work surface and sewing machine setup makes a huge difference for smooth, hassle-free quilting. In fact, I would say your table that you put your machine on is probably as important as the machine itself. When I get to the end of this row of quilting, I'll cut thread and then continue quilting the next row, either above or below, depending on my plan. My number one tip for controlling the bulk is to rotate and scrunch your quilt however you need to, so you always feel comfortable and in control. If you have a hard time stitching smooth lines up and down, you can rotate your quilt and stitch switchbacks from side to side instead. My tip is to keep the area you are quilting in this design relatively small. If it's too wide of a space, you'll have a hard time quilting smooth, straight-ish lines. When quilting the lines this way, you'll start at the top of a row of quilting and work your way all the way down the row from top to bottom. So you'll divide and conquer the quilting by stitching one complete row at a time, cutting thread, and then starting back up with the next row at the top again. You'll work your way one row at a time from right to left, just like you did when you were anchor quilting. Then rotate the quilt again in the middle to work your way back over the other side. Once the switchbacks are done, it's time to take a final pass across the quilt, filling in the darker colorful areas with another machine quilting design. And here's a bonus tip. Use a plain backing if you really want your quilting to shine. So we're going to divide and conquer again and quilt wavy lines in one pieced row at a time from top to bottom. You can do this free motion, or you can switch back to your walking foot or dual feed. I quilted 4 wavy lines in each vertical row. To keep them relatively even, first I quilted the lines next to the original straight line echoes. Then I visually divided up the space in the middle of each row and decided that 2 more lines of quilting would fit. Nothing is marked. The lines are all pretty irregular and organic, but the texture looks amazing, don't you think? Just like before, I'm quilting a complete pass across the quilt, one row at a time, starting on the right-hand side of the quilt and working my way towards the center. When I reach the middle, I'll rotate the quilt and finish quilting the lines, working my way back over to the right. It's all about dividing up the space and conquering one design at a time. And you know what? You can totally vary from your quilting plan at any time. Sometimes I only know part of the design I want to quilt, so I'll go ahead and quilt that part and then it'll come to me later on. Now that you know how to quilt these designs, you can adjust them to fit any quilt you want. Just break down the process with some of the ditches to anchor and secure the quilt, then pick 2 different designs to quilt in different areas of your quilt. Remember, there's no right or wrong answer when it comes to machine quilting, and half the fun is trying out different designs to see how they look. Well, now that my quilt is quilted, it's time to trim it up and add the binding. I actually prefer to bind my quilts by hand, but you can check out the description box below for tutorials on how to bind it by machine. I prefer to trim my quilt all the way around so the edges are completely flush with nothing sticking out. Once my binding is sewn to the front, I'll wrap it around to the back and secure with binding clips to hold it in place. So my binding strips are cut 2 inches wide so that they will finish exactly 1/4 inch wide on both sides. I prefer to hold the quilt out in front of me and stitch from right to left with the binding facing towards me. I'll stitch and remove the clips as I go. A thimble helps me push the needle and thread through the binding. I'm only using 1 strand of thread and my stitches are pretty small and tight. But basically I'm taking a stitch through a tiny bit of the backing and the crease in the binding as I go, then pulling the thread through 1 stitch at a time. Each time I make the next stitch, I push the needle through behind where it previously went in. This really secures the thread each time, and it doesn't really take that long. I estimate that it takes me about a half an hour to a full hour to sew each side of the quilt, depending on how big it is. So I'll usually sit back and relax when it's time to bind. I'll listen to an audiobook or catch up on my podcast while I stitch, or sometimes I'll watch a movie while I do my handwork. If I'm in a hurry, I'll stitch it down by machine, and you can check out my other YouTube tutorials showing how to do that. But if I have the time, I really do prefer the look of a clean hand finish. Here are some photo finishes of my charming Chevrons quilt. I enjoyed taking it with me on a recent beach vacation to snap some snazzy photos. I love how the light and shadows really show off the stitch definition in the quilting. When you have a fun finish to share, be sure to use #CharmingChevronsQuilt on social media so I can see how your version of this quilt turned out. Well, there you have it, another fun finish on the books. Be sure to stop by my site and grab a copy of the Charming Chevrons quilt pattern so you can make this quilt just like I've shown you. And be sure to check out my quilt kit section to see what's new. I'm here to guide you every step of the way. Until next time, happy quilting!